For this week's Weekly Focus, where we dissect the hottest topic of the week, it's the somber anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ahead of the occasion, UN General Assembly adopted a symbolic resolution calling for peace in the region. Now, leaders around the world also spoke up and took more actions this week. For more on this developing story, we have our foreign affairs correspondent Choi Min-jung for details. Welcome, Min-jung.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. So let's first go back to Tuesday when Russian President Vladimir Putin said the war was necessary, just like he said a year ago, right?
Right, Dami. Putin delivered a State of the Nation address on Tuesday, and he claimed Russia had no choice but to attack Ukraine. He blamed the West for causing the conflict in Ukraine and added Western countries led by the U.S. are seeking unlimited power. Putin also announced that Moscow will be suspending the New START nuclear reduction treaty with the U.S., which is the last remaining nuclear arms agreement signed with Washington.
They want to deliver us a strategic defeat and claim our nuclear facilities. Regarding this, I have to say that Russia suspends its participation in the New START treaty.
The New START treaty limits the number of intercontinental range nuclear weapons that the U.S. and Russia can have. Now, Putin did stress that Russia is not completely abandoning the treaty, but only suspending it. The comments raised concerns that Moscow might be preparing for a nuclear war. However, Kremlin spokesman dampened fears by telling reporters the suspension of the treaty will not increase the risk of nuclear war. However, analysts are saying that it's concerning that Putin has put out the possibility of resuming nuclear tests, as it would escalate the tensions to a whole new level. Experts are saying that it could become much more than the Cold War, as it would prompt other countries like China, India, and Pakistan to build up their weapons as well.
Right, Russia maintaining its stubborn action on the war. And also on Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden also had a lot to say during his semi-secret trip to Europe. Let's talk about that.
Right, Biden gave a speech in Warsaw just a day after his secret visit to Kyiv. He promised that Russia will never defeat Ukraine and also reaffirmed his unwavering support for the country.
Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
Biden had paid a surprise visit to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, on Monday, where he was greeted by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, Biden's visit to a war zone was unprecedented in modern times and a tightly kept secret until the last moment. Only a handful of aides and 2 journalists were allowed to travel with the president, and they were sworn to secrecy and had their mobile phones taken away. It only makes sense to keep the trip undercover, as such an audacious trip by the president is unprecedented in modern times. You know, usually presidential trips would have the backup of heavy U.S. military presence, like during wartime in Iraq and Afghanistan, but that wasn't the case this time around. And secrecy also comes in a bid to protect the Ukrainians just in case Russia launches a large-scale attack.
Right, and it wasn't just a trip and words of warnings. Washington also slapped fresh new sanctions on Moscow, right? And what kind of commitment was there to support Ukraine on the international level then?
Right, the U.S. reportedly imposed new sanctions on some 200 Russian individuals and entities this week. The Wall Street Journal reported that this is part of efforts by Washington and its allies to further isolate the Russian economy. And it also serves to cut Moscow off from access to critical resources that could bolster its military and technology sectors. And countries also vowed to provide additional support for Kyiv during the Munich Security Conference held last week. Estonia's prime minister proposed a plan for the EU to ramp up ammunition purchases for Ukraine's defense, and the Polish prime minister said he will speak to the U.S. about increasing Washington's military presence in Poland in response to Russian threats.
Right, lots of military actions coming from Western countries, but it's not just Western countries heavily being involved in the whole Ukraine crisis. It's also China. So what's China's stance at the moment?
Right. Well, the war in Ukraine has really underscored rising tensions between the world's 2 superpowers, the U.S. and China. While Biden's surprise visit to Kyiv and his speech the day after highlighted the West's commitment to Ukraine, China showcased a favor in the opposite direction to Russia. On Wednesday, China's top foreign policy advisor Wang Yi met Putin in Moscow, and the two reaffirmed their strong relations, saying that they are reaching new milestones. The Wall Street Journal also reported that Putin is likely to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping in the coming months. Now, China has been accused of considering providing lethal weapon support to Moscow, and on top of that, it has reportedly been helping Russia evade Western sanctions aimed to cripple its economy by drastically increasing energy trade and replacing Western suppliers with Beijing's. The U.S. support for Ukraine and China's support for Russia signifies the power struggle between Washington and Beijing. It looks like neither of the countries will side with one other, given the rivalry that has built up, especially with the divide recently worsening over an alleged Chinese surveillance balloon. In fact, pundits say China may favor the war being prolonged, believing that it could distract the U.S. from building efforts to prevent China's dominance in Asia.
Right, and no one knew that the war would last this long, but we're already a year into the crisis. The battle is expected to drag on further. What's the outlook for that?
Right, Dami, the war has entered its second year and there seems to be no end in sight. Most experts say it's impossible to predict which side will seize the victory. Some believe that the war is likely to escalate but could end this year as the intensity of the fighting is too high to be maintained for long. A former CIA officer says that sometime soon, Putin will come to realize that his army is no longer capable of taking back what he calls Russian territories, which opens up the possibility of him using nuclear weapons. If this were the case, the U.S. and Ukraine will have to think about how they can deter Russia and respond to a potential mass casualty disaster.
Indeed, spring also may be a tipping point as both sides are reportedly preparing for a mass spring offensive.
Right.
All right. Thanks for your report, Minjang.
Thank you.